Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I welcome you all, all of you, to our event this afternoon. I really appreciate everybody's participation, and this is very exciting for us. Actually, we have three distinguished panelists here for this afternoon's program. Certainly, you know, it is no surprise, and it's a topic that is on everybody's minds right now, and it's hot kind of in the press. But what we really wanted to do was take an opportunity to create the space among some of our panelists who are experts with a diversity of backgrounds to create an open conversation on this topic. We do also want to get some audience participation. So towards the end, we've reserved about 20 minutes for Q&A. But this afternoon will really be more of a conversation amongst the panelists. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce some of our panelists that are, all of our panelists that are on with us. Dr. Jalil Abdul Adil, who is the director of, is a co-director at the Urban Youth Trauma Center through UIC, the University of Illinois at Chicago. And he has been a personal mentor to me and a consultant to Khalil Center since its very inception. In fact, when we first even had the idea way back, if you can recall, it was myself and another brother that came into his office and kind of talked through what we really wanted to do. And he has been really instrumental to us through our development as an institution, and I can say personally for myself as well. And Dr. Jalil does a lot of work with urban youth trauma, and he works on sort of you know, partnerships, community partnerships with many organizations in providing trainings and supervision and programming that is designed to kind of address youth trauma. And he's had a special focus on the inner city, and in particular in the city of Chicago. He's been here since '89, working in the city. Then we have, so I want to jump over to Sister Dana. Sister Dana is the co-founder of Zakat Foundation. As you all know, Zakat Foundation is, Khalil Center is a Zakat Foundation project. So there are umbrella kind of parent organization. And Sister Dana is also the wife of the other founder of Zakat Foundation, which is, and the executive director, Mr. Halil Demir. For those in the Chicagoland area, you all probably know them very well, and perhaps even beyond Chicago. She's a registered nurse as well, doing a lot of work in the healthcare industry. And she's been doing and involved in a lot of community programming and efforts, and also travels. She's been traveling a lot to the Muslim world. You know, Zakat Foundation has a lot of projects outside of the US, humanitarian efforts, WAL projects, orphanship, Syrian refugee. And so she's been very heavily involved in those projects as well. So I welcome her to our event. And of course, we've come to know each other over the years through her, you know, investment in Khalil Center and helping consult with us and being privy to a lot of the programs that we've done. We've done a lot of programs together, and our relationships have grown. Our families' relationships have grown over the years. Next we have Sheikh Abdul Malik Merchant. Sheikh Abdul Malik is a graduate of al-Qura from Mecca in Saudi Arabia. He's from the U.S., of course, native to the U.S. And you know, I want to kind of say that in case people thought that he's kind of a Saudi imam that we brought in. That's not the case. He was a former imam in Boston at ISBCC. Now he serves as a chaplain at Tufts University, and our relationship has also grown over the past several years. we've been corresponding and talking together about doing some joint and collaborative projects. Alhamdulillah, he had us over, myself and Dr. Rania, for a program in Boston, and we had him here in Chicago. And so we've been collaborating on a couple of different projects, and our relationship has grown. And so I felt, reaching out to all of you all who are very intimately aware of Khalil Center and the work that we do, and I thought that we would really convene this panel, because at Khalil Center we're really focused on addressing really important issues within our community, and addressing them through kind of the mental health lens, right? And so trauma is really sort of up our alley with regard to this conversation, as well as kind of the Islamic theological and Islamic basis of trying to sort of put some perspective on this for our community as to how they can kind of understand some of these issues as Muslims here in America, as well as what we could be doing practically to be able to do better. And of course, we're not going to, the objective of this is not to end racism. I don't think that's going to happen overnight. Certainly we have a limitation in time. So, this is a very complex and multifaceted conversation. None of us, believes that we're going to address all components, as well as the African-American experience itself is very diverse, right? And not monolithic. And so there's so many different layers and types of experiences that need to be taken into consideration. So I make those disclaimers so that people do understand that. And really what we wanted to do is begin the conversation, and hopefully we'll have some follow-ups that we'll do to try to address different aspects of this issue, inshaAllah ta'ala. So I welcome you all, Jazakumullah khair for joining us, both as attendees as well as our distinguished panel. So I'm going to jump right in, inshallah, if you all don't mind. And as you're chiming in, you can feel free to say more about your introduction or correct me if I've made any mistakes in introducing you. And so the first kind of component that we wanted to tackle is the historical trauma. We know that this has a long history, that this is not an isolated event that just happened with George Floyd and the riots and the protests. There is a long history with regard to the African-American struggle here in the US. And so we wanted to kind of open with giving a little bit of contextualization, looking back in order to sort of understand the present a little bit better. And so I'm going to open it to, pose this to Sheikh Abdul Malik, if he wants to kind of open the floor, give us a little bit of context and background. And of course, the panelists know that this is a conversation. You're more than welcome to kind of jump in, add feedback or points to each other's comments, and we'll slowly kind of unravel the issue as we go through the different major talking points and subtopics that we really want to address for today. So, تفضل سيدي Abdul Malik, barakallahu fikum.
بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره مقدار عظيم. Jazakumullah khair, Human and Khalil Center, for allowing me to be with you all this afternoon, inshallah. With regard to any historical event or anything historical, it's impossible to summarize it in any short period of time. We're talking about the last 400 plus years of the history of a people, of my people. And so just to really help give context, I thought it would only be befitting if we started with sharing this timeline so that we can see together what we're talking about and specifically what it is, where I'm talking about. And so just to, before we begin, we have American slavery and segregation. in 1526, so generally speaking, when we're talking about the history of enslaved people in America, we're thinking about 1619. There was recently New York Times, big project, but actually in 1526, the first enslaved Africans were brought here with Spanish explorers, about 100 of them, and they happened to disappear within about a week's time. And the reason why 1619 is really an important date in our history as Americans, but specifically as the children of these enslaved Africans, is because that is when the category of slavery became something that was a thing. Before that, people of color, people of African descent, or specifically Africans at that time, they lived in this sort of homogenous way with Europeans and the natives of this land. So, but the goal of the Europeans in coming to America were purely of capitalistic origins, of capitalistic intent. And so after the genocide of the indigenous, the natives, at around 1619, that is when it became a law, it became permissible, legal, to bring enslaved Africans who were stolen and kidnapped or whatever means they were brought to this country to serve as slaved or enslaved peoples. And so this history, this struggle is one that has a long history. The struggle of people of color is something that the activist and scholar Vincent Harding, he said that it's sometimes powerful, tumultuous, rolling with life, at other times meandering and turgid, covered with ice and snows, and seemingly of endless winters, all too often streaked with the running of blood. And I mention that because we're talking about people like Omar ibn Said and so many more that were taken out of a very comfortable life in West Africa, and then enslaved, chained, and brought here to a whole new land that spoke nothing. And so it didn't speak the language or the culture, and then forced into slavery. And so from 1619 all the way to 1863, this was legal. All of this time, this was something where people were bought halfway across the world, across the Atlantic, for this 339 years, and lived in this fashion. They lived enslaved and trapped. And it wasn't until 1865 that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and slavery was eradicated and deemed illegal. Now in 1806, it was illegal to bring to bring enslaved peoples to America, but that still happened. And after that, at 1865, when the Emancipation Proclamation happened, then that was when the children of these enslaved people, or perhaps even some of these people that were bought from Africa, were then set free. And I use air quotes here because this setting free, the Emancipation Proclamation, wasn't something that we have like the internet of today. It was where a law was passed, and not everyone knew. People still lived in this for multiple years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. But then the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. African Americans and the children of enslaved people now are no longer forced to live in bondage and forced to live in this chattel slavery. And then we have this miraculous period that is known as the Reconstruction era. From 1865 until 1877, African Americans or Black Americans lived and thrived in a multitude of different cities all over the United States. We had what was known as the Black Wall Street. We had politicians, we had banks, we had businesses that at 1877, a little over 10 years later, due to racist and other means, was completely destroyed, burned to the ground. And so the reason why I'm trying to paint this picture so we can understand, again, our topic of today is historical and generational trauma. We're talking about people that lived up to 339 years enslaved, finally able to have a sense of quote unquote freedom, and then are able to thrive because of it. And at just 10, 12 years later, racists destroy, burn, and demolish all of this that has happened. And so then this time of segregation. This is when Jim Crow laws come about. This is when laws of legal segregation now are brought. Before you had where in the Constitution, African Americans and the children of enslaved Africans are considered 3/5 of a human being. They're not even deemed legally as full humans. And now we live in a time, or they lived in a time between 1865 and 1954, which really could continue on into 1965, where there is legal segregation between this newly founded, first time, very modern concept of race, where it was illegal to use certain restaurants and to drink from certain fountains. It was illegal to ride in the front of the bus or to even get married to someone that was of European descent while you are a person of African descent. And so now we have 89, more than that really, until 1965 is when the 1963, 1965, the Board versus Education is passed, and then the Voter Rights Act is passed. But then it doesn't stop there. You know, in our very our postmodern era, we like to think of slavery, and we like to think of 1965 happens, Voter Rights Act, Board versus Education, and the children of enslaved Africans are now free. You can live. And then we had 8 years of Obama, and we had this sense of, mashallah, you know, there's no restriction now. It's not held, but that's really not what happened. And from 1965, as soon as segregation is deemed illegal, from then until at least 1977, it was legal for banks to segregate and to redline is the term that is used, but to not give loans and restrict where people of color were allowed to live. And so this then creates the modern ghetto. If we have certain areas that are deemed illegal, or they're not deemed illegal, but they're not able, Black folk are not able to buy houses in those areas, that then segregates our school system, because you're only going to go to school where you're able to, and therefore, because it's all people that, it's not a diverse society, people are really starting to get on their feet, then this affects the tax dollars that feed those schools. Then there is, if you're not able to buy a house, then you aren't able to generate wealth, and therefore you aren't able to create generational wealth that you can then give on to your descendants. And that really is crippled and stifled. And then because you're really just coming out of segregation, it's a very challenging era. And so that goes until 1977, where that is then deemed illegal. It still happens, but okay, let's just say for argument's sake, 1977. From 1971 until roughly 2009, we have the war on drugs, where people whom drug laws or mass incarceration, where they're now racially and systematically subjugated to incrimination, starting with Nixon, then into Reagan, and then, what only then further destabilizes the Black community. It only further, economically, socially, and in every way form possible. And so this is just a very brief overview of what we're talking about, of how generationally things have happened, where it then impacts what people think about it. Du Bois talks about in The Souls of Black Folk, the Freedmen Bank. Just for an example, something tangible that we can take from this. The Freedmen Bank was a bank that was started so that the people who are no longer slaves in this Reconstruction era are allowed to invest their money and now start to save money, invest money, and then potentially grow capital. Due to multiple reasons, this was no longer able to happen, and the bank foreclosed. What that means is the money that people had then put into a bank no longer exists. Everything, your life savings that you put thinking you were going to get interest from, obviously we know that's haram, but thinking that you're going to get money from, that your investment's going to grow, now all of your savings are gone. And Du Bois talks about in 1909 that this alone made people, and then he continues on talking about it in Philadelphia Negro, this eradicates the trust that Black folk had in banks. And we no longer can trust banks, and therefore we're no longer saving in banks. And that made for certain people, obviously there's no monolithic culture amongst African Americans. Even in segregation time, Du Bois is talking about this, but this created a sentiment where if we can't trust banks, then we're at least going to spend our money on what we can have right now. And so again, that's just a brief overview that I would love for now my co-panelists here to really just jump in and talking about historical and generational trauma.
Well, can you hear me okay?
Hold on, please.
Thank you. You know, and I'd like to, let me just add my 2 cents in there. That was a wonderful introduction, I want to say. Thank you so much. Historically speaking, let's also add in, if you want to add a little bit about healthcare. When we talk about segregation, when we talk about historical access to care, how many African American people have died because they were not allowed, they weren't allowed access to care. There was no access to care. Segregation in hospitals. I mean, we could go on and on and on. Segregation in hospital settings, segregation in the military. My father, coincidentally, was one of the first Black Marines in this country. But many people died. And I think for those of us who don't know this information, we really need to just think of it and accept the fact that we have actually lived in our own US apartheid. We have lived and survived and thrived under apartheid. Many women died giving childbirth in this country, through accidents, all kinds of usual trauma circumstances, where they were not allowed in the hospital. Or they might maybe get there, but no one would treat them because they didn't want to touch a Black person physically. So that all adds in. That's all I got to say on that one.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin. Wa salatu wa salamu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum, panelists and audience. And alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair to the Khalil Center for opening this space for what we want to be honest dialogue. And I'd like to just chime in a few points related to the historical trauma to go along what my fellow panelists have said. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in Quran, Ya ayyuhal ladina amanu kunu qawamina bil qisti shuhada'a lillahi wa law ala anfusikum. That we are obligated to stand forth for justice. Oh, you who believe, stand forth for justice, even if it's against ourselves. And as we know from the ayah, it goes on to point out it's against ourselves, our parents, our kin, whether they're rich or they're poor. Allah will protect us both. This is our responsibility. And so I'm pleased to see a panel and a center which is encouraging us to fulfill our responsibility to stand up for oppressed peoples. And I'm going to just highlight a few talking points to extract from the historical record. And since we said we're going to have an open, honest conversation, let me say it bluntly. First of all, African American communities have gone through historical trauma. Now, there are many definitions of historical trauma. The brief one I'll offer here is it's the cumulative, collective, emotional, and psychological wounding of an individual or a generation that's caused by a trauma, like a genocide, an enslavement, or an ethnic cleansing. Now, what we have heard historically has been an African Holocaust that conservative estimates said 12 to 14 million Africans were taken in the transatlantic slave trade, and only a fraction ever made it here alive. And those who did make it here alive were subject to what we are now calling, in a sanitized term, systemic racism. Actually was white supremacy in furtherance of capitalism that was specifically founded on anti-Black racism. There was rape, there's mutilation, there's murder, there's thievery of wages, there was confinement, there was torture. There were many things which were done which damaged the psyche of this community, which, as Sheikh Abdul Malik mentioned, coming from a very grand and glorious existence in Africa. Some of the recent research being done by Dr. Bilal Ware Sylvia Diop, I think is how it's pronounced, slaves of Allah, and others pointing out that there were both free, thriving people of African descent, as well as laborers who were brought with early Dutch and Spanish colonizers. So before the United States was even a thought in somebody's mind, African people, including African Muslims, who came from a strong, rich, and proud tradition of Islamic adab, of Islamic scholarship, of literacy, of science. And this was at a time when Timbuktu, Mali, Ghana, and those areas were above and considered the international center of Islamic scholarship and administration and civilization. So you juxtapose coming from a very, very advanced country and being kidnapped and all the other atrocities, trapped and taken to a new place where not only were you not afforded some of the basic humanities, which is unconscionable in the mind of a civilized person, but you were subjected to daily, permanent, and intergenerational enslavement, humiliation, and really Holocaust/genocide. Keep in mind, some scholars, you can look up Joy DeGruy's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and others, talked about this historical trauma fractured people mentally, emotionally, and physically throughout generations, and this was passed on biologically, psychosocially, and culturally. Okay, the reason I say that is we really got to get a grip on the enormity of what has happened throughout generations that has led up to the behavior, the despair, and the oppression that we see going on today. Now, again, because we are having an honest conversation, we need to talk about the relationship between not only the larger system of white supremacy and anti-Black racism, but the police. Please note, historically, the first police in this country were people who functioned on behalf of slavery as slave patrols. They were joined by people who were the unofficial extensions of militias that would only function to control, oppress, torture, and when necessary, kill people of African descent who would not agree to be subservient and silent in the face of their oppression of the enslavement system. As Muslim, this should particularly touch us because some of the first organized, effective, and ongoing resistance to systematic racism and oppression were by Muslims, to the extent that they would pass laws beginning with the Spanish to try to ban, this was the first Muslim ban, to try to ban Muslims from even being brought over here as slaves because they refused to surrender and submit to their existing anti-Black racist system. And so this is part of the Muslim legacy in this country that we need to embrace, standing up for justice. And so when we see things in Minnesota, we're looking back to a 600-year to sometimes 700-year context of people being denied some of the basic rights that humans deserve, even down to the most basic thing you could do as a human being, which is to breathe. When we look at law enforcement, there are many articles out there. I encourage you, again, as Sheikh Abdul Malik said, we can't go through all of it here. We're just giving some food for thought, okay? But there are articles which talk about just the relationship between the police and people of African descent in Minnesota. We won't forget about Philando Castile. We won't forget about many situations which have happened that have caused for the harassment, racial profiling, the discrimination, and yes, the murder of people of African descent, including African Americans. And it's no surprise that even, this might surprise some people, even in my lifetime, in some states it was still illegal to even intermarry. Within my lifetime, to even intermarry. And the police are merely the physical implementation of state policy. And I want to caution us, because I've been raised in the North. I spent part of my life being raised in the South, and I was going back and forth in between because of my family. racism, white supremacy, white terrorism against people of African descent was never only a Southern problem. If you look at the history of this country, the South perfected it and built its economy and its social structure based on it. But don't forget, the North was complicit, from an industrial perspective, of partaking and benefiting and perpetuating this same system of white supremacy and Black oppression, including trading the labor and the products as the industrial center for the country. And even more so, the West was founded on a supremacy that even some people of African descent were taken as slaves or against their will or through an extension of Jim Crow out into the West to help settle the West, not as co-settlers, not as fellow human beings, but as forced labor. So this has been a national problem. Racial profiling, false imprisonment, police brutality, militia terrorism, whether it was a white supremacist gangs, whether it was the Ku Klux Klan, the Citizens Council, and all those other organizations, this is not a new phenomenon. So when we see now today, police still do not have the proper respect for African-American life, particularly if you're from the lower income, more marginalized urban populations of which I work with every day. Do not be surprised, because this is a 600-year pattern of which we're still seeing the continuous manifestations today. I will see, if you plant a bitter seed, you're going to get bitter fruit. And the thing, as a Muslim, we have to feel like in the path of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who walked through Mecca and saw the oppression and didn't say, let me just take care of me, let me just take care of mine, let me stay out of the way, hopefully they won't bother me. We have to rise up to this responsibility of standing with and for people who are oppressed as Muslims for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'll pass it on to one of my other panelists.
I can really appreciate that, Dr. Jalil. Jazakallah khair for really kind of keeping it real and letting us know what really happened without kind of sugarcoating it and without putting the layers. Sister Donna, it looks like you want to kind of add something. Please welcome.
I would agree. I would agree, concur with what Dr. Jalil has stated. We all have a responsibility to stand up here. You know, I've asked a few very close friends and colleagues on board who are not Muslim, but who are very dear and close friends to the social justice cause, and you know, we have to get on board here. I think all of us, there's a lot expected of us to get in line with this social justice and what's right and wrong. We know what's right and wrong. We know that. I wanted to add another important factor as we went through history. I want to encourage everybody to look up the history of the NRA, National Rifle Association, how it was founded. Very easy to just throw it in, Google it. NAACP stands for National oh my God, National Advancement of what talks about how the NRA was actually founded, and it's rooted very much in having a sense of controlling guns that the newly freed slaves would get. It was also a way of monitoring how many ex-slaves could get guns, and that's something that a lot of people really are just not aware of the founding of the NRA. Another quick point I want to bring up, and I'm sure it's going to come up anyway, but we need to talk a little bit historically. We need to talk about lynchings. Lynchings, you don't go on as often. I mean, an actual lynching, rope lynching, but we've had a few in the last several years. I think it was one in Texas. Somebody can correct me with that one. But from 1882 to 1986, there were 5,000 lynchings in the United States. And here, and I'm rounding up, rounding down a little bit here or there, but what's very important, I think, for everyone to know here is that out of those 5,000 lynchings, and you know, give or take a couple of hundred, so I'm just rounding to keep the numbers easy. Out of the 5,000, 4,000 were Black, of people of African descent. But here's a surprising note. A little over 1,000 of those people were actually whites who supported the freedom of blacks. That's something that, you know, people, we need to know that. In the 60s, our struggle as African Americans was very much supported by Christians, Jews, whites. You know, we have a sense of social justice and what our responsibility is. We all know this. And this is a very good time. It's groundbreaking. We're segueing into something where we all have to assume our responsibility here. We cannot do this alone. So I just wanted to add that real quick about the lynching. Last thing, 25% of those lynched, 25% of that, let's say 4,000, okay, were actually accused of sexual misconduct. And we're seeing a lot now of how the lies are continually being bought up, unfortunately, by whites and by women. That are people, they're just very, very on board to calling the police on black men, continually, left and right. So that's it.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Donna. Actually, I wanted to kind of transition into talking a little bit about the generational aspect of this, right? I think we've talked about the history of how, like, the early history is so horrendous, right? But here we are today. There's certainly remnants and systematic inequalities that continue and that persist today, right? When we're talking about the plea bargains, I mean, even stories like my own, experience of just being shocked as a Canadian when I moved to the U.S. Certainly Canada is not absolved of racism, right? But but just the sheer magnitude of these ghettos, right? Going into the south side of Chicago, when I was invited to join some brothers at a masjid, it's just that invisible borders was just so striking to me, that they're not all that invisible. And you have almost, you're leaving into another America, like you're in another country. So it was very striking to me. So I'm very cognizant of the fact that this is absolutely something that is continuing. And we can see with what's happening with police brutality and perhaps with Donald Trump, there's sort of like, the curtain's off. You see what I'm saying? With Obama, maybe there was a little bit of a beginning of a false sense of those who don't live that experience, right? That live outside of that world, that, you know what, we've come really far. But I want to get your guys' thoughts on this issue, on the generational aspect. I mean, on the panelists, we have a diversity of age groups, without calling out anybody's physical, with the numbers here, because I know, sometimes it's a little bit more sensitive when you talk about age issues. But certainly I know.
No, I'm 61. Go ahead. I'm a very proud 61, mashallah. I got a lot of stories. Thank you, Brother Human, for the respect.
And you see myself and Sheikh Abdul Malik, are in a different generation than you all are in, right? The two of you. And so you all have seen things that we've read about, right? And so I just wanted to kind of speak to and understand, what is the generational impact of this? Maybe, Sheikh Abdul Malik, you could speak from like the newer generation, that's coming up right now, and what your experience of all of this stuff, like Dr. Jaleel was talking about, Sister Donna's seen some of this stuff in healthcare physically, right? Like that sort of transition. Dr. Jaleel's talking about, marriage, interracial marriage being outlawed during his lifetime, right? And so what is it like for you, where we are at today, from a generational kind of perspective?
It's interesting because, I've really got Du Bois in my mind, but even post-emancipation, there was a generational gap between people who lived through enslavement and people whom Du Bois says are like the stories of their childhood. And so now post 65, people who lived through the civil rights era versus my generation and today, it's very easy for me, I'll speak about myself and not my generation or age group, but it's very easy for me to forget about Rodney King, because that was in '93 when I was little. And that was back when video cameras were on your shoulder. It wasn't like what we're seeing today, where we had 17 police officers beat a man on camera, all walk. And then the subsequent riots and protests that happened afterwards in all over the country, but most specifically in LA. It's very easy for me to forget about the work and the efforts that had to go in the civil rights era. So the reason why I mentioned that is because when I see protests and what's going on across the country, because of my academic training, one, it makes me feel like, where's the organization? But speaking specifically on generational trauma, I was blessed to have grown up in a situation where I myself, nor those in my immediate social circle, never experienced police brutality or incarceration. I was never in jail or anything of that sort. But because of the fact that I'm connected to others and I know people whom have, and I've been pulled over and seen the racial prejudice and how I'm treated in a car, I naturally have anxiety when I see a cop car on my back, or if a car looks like it could be a cop car. I don't know why people buy Ford Explorers, but if that car is behind me and it's just a black Ford Explorer, because in Boston, those are the cars the cops drive, my heart rate automatically elevates. And just, okay, again, I've never experienced any police brutality, but have seen that, that's what I feel. Now, my son is 7 years old. He's never seen anything close to what I have. But when he sees those lights, you can see his heart rate elevate. And this is what, when we're talking about generational and things that are inherited, that's generational. He's literally just taking it from seeing Baba and Mama when are we getting pulled over? What's going on? All right, everything, turn the radio off. Put your license on the driver's board because I have to get ready. And those are things. So just speaking from my generation, those are some of the things that you inherit. But yeah, I'll let my co-panelists speak.
So I'll chime in here. I won't say I'm a proud 55, but I'm 55. And alhamdulillah, I think it's an important point to note here that I probably could be considered those who grew up in the post-civil rights era or were able to benefit from the struggles that my parents, who were very active in the civil rights era, by the way, that we should have seen the benefits of that. And there certainly were some subtle changes, there were some symbolic changes, but there was no structural changes to the extent that relieved the masses of the suffering that they were going through. And my parents always raised me, even though we were a middle-class background, middle-class African-Americans, both my parents got their master's degrees. Education was something that was expected in my family. We knew we were connected to a community that struggle still remained. And I think it's very important that we haven't highlighted that some of the reasons that the structural problems continued is, again, because of the law enforcement presence that remained in the African-American community, even as they were trying to struggle through systemic racism. Don't forget how closely law enforcement worked with the white supremacist groups. You certainly can't forget, and it was put in the chat, which is important, there was the systematic targeting of African-American leaders under the counterintelligence program under J. Edgar Hoover, which systematically sought to disrupt, destroy, and otherwise neutralize the African-American liberation movement, which really were just asking for basic promises to be fulfilled. So when we look and we see the absence of the African-Americans able to fundamentally root out systemic racism, it is because of the presence of continuing policies. It's also because of the link between the policies and the police. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't die from old age. Alhaji Malik Shabazz didn't die from old age. Here in Chicago, Fred Hampton did not die from old age. The Black Panther chapters around the country, they didn't close because of their own inertia. There was a systematic persecution which happened, which was to remove and eliminate any leaders who, in their words of the documents, from the government a Black Messiah who could rally the masses to actually achieve Black liberation. So it's important to mention that. Why are we still dealing with this? Because some of the resources have been taken from the communities as they've tried to organize themselves. Now, as far as me, I have, from an African-American middle-class background, college educated, doctorate degree, I have been racially profiled. I have been harassed. I have watched police brutality live before I had the cell phones. I have been in places like when we were in college, there used to be called a Black College Spring Break, where we went to Virginia Beach. You know, Sister Donna, you may remember this. We would go to Virginia Beach as all the Black students from around the country to kind of hang out and have some solidarity. And because Virginia Beach did not want that large number of young African Americans coming, they used to turn the police loose to harass and bother, and I saw brutalize even African American students for minor things such as loitering, standing around, not moving along fast enough, not complying with directives, just trumped up things to harass, profile, and brutalize. And I've been walking through DC when I was in Howard University, and I came around the corner and I saw an African American male who, because he was jaywalking, was beat up by 7 police. And when we were standing there as young students saying, what is going on, paralyzed with fear, they threatened us if we didn't move along fast enough. And trust me, they weren't joking, okay? I have been driving down the street with my friend, pulled over with lights and guns drawn, saying, we heard there was a crime by somebody looked just like you. And only because I was taught and had the talk at a very young age to never, ever leave your house without your license is the only reason I didn't get handcuffed and taken downtown without even a second thought. And I learned these things because I know, despite my so-called middle-class background, despite the so-called post-civil rights era, you have to try to survive contact with law enforcement when you are a person of color, particularly African Americans. And so I, similar to Sheikh Abdul Malik, I, alhamdulillah, so far, have never been in jail. I've never been arrested, alhamdulillah, so far. But the presence of the police and connection to people who, the communities I work in who are lower income, you feel that fear, intimidation, that disrespect, that harassment. So then when you see what happens with George Floyd and all the other incidents, you're not surprised. It's almost a reinforcer. And to Sister Donna's point, the window we have of an opening of conscience across the country, that's something that's always been there. Trust me, we talked about history. We could also mention John Brown, okay? We could mention the people who were part of the Quakers, the Underground Railroad. People of conscience have always been there. We just, as Muslims, we have to encourage ourselves to really step up, join, or even challenge ourselves to exceed, taking advantage of this window of opportunity to really fully understand what people of African descent have gone through and address the systemic racism, including, but not limited to, the police misconduct, so this can stop.
If I could just jump in, you mentioned something, Dr. Jalil, about the issues and how they sort of make us feel in the systemic problems. I think I would be remiss to mention how the Immigration Act of post-65 allowed people to come to this country and come with education or come with opportunity and check off on the census box, white. And so I can't speak to any particular person's experience, but what we do know is that drastically changed the dynamic between Muslims in this country, and therefore then made it so that people who came from Islamic cultures or Muslim backgrounds then had the ability, the language to say, well, this is Islamic and this is how Islam should be, which then within our smaller nucleus of a Muslim community created segregation within our community, which then created an uncomfortability. I, as someone who's lived overseas for 10 years, alhamdulillah, and speaks Arabic fluently without an accent, bifadlillahi ta'ala, and worked as an imam in one of the biggest mosques in New England have been in the presence of other imams who won't speak to me in Arabic and will refuse, like they just refuse to do that. And there's no other reason, because the other imam next to me, he's speaking to him in Arabic, but switches back to English to me. I can get down with y'all too. Or going to places in the assumption being that, you know, am I Muslim? Wallahi, I was in the Kaaba, in the Haram, the Masjid of the Kaaba, sitting down reading a green mushaf with a thobe on, looking at the Kaaba. And a brother came over to me, and after he found out where I was from, said, "Are you Muslim?" And I just looked down at the Quran, I looked at the Kaaba, I looked at the Quran, I looked at the Kaaba, I was like, bro, really? Like, you asked me that. And so these sentiments within our community creates distrust and creates systemic issues as to why post 9/11, everyone's kumbaya, but before 9/11, we really didn't work together. And so I think we just need to mention and name that too, within our community, what colonialist and colorist ideas do we bring into our experience that then impact how we interact with our brothers and sisters on an intra-faith level.
So, Sister Donna, actually, I just want to invite you, Sister Donna, to also, you know, you live in a predominantly, you know, Arab community, right? I mean, not to single out any particular community, but it's just representative of many communities where there's a predominantly non-African American base, be it South Asian, Turkish, Arab, or whatnot. But I know that you certainly have a wealth of experience in growing up in various communities, but in particular in a very kind of heavily dense Muslim populated kind of area as a minority, as a Muslim in those areas. So I was wondering, of course, I want to hear from your comments that you want to make, but also if you get a chance to sort of touch on your experience living as a Muslim, right? Who also you embraced Islam, right? And then you also married an immigrant too. So, so it's just, you have such an interesting kind of intersectional experience, lived experience that I know I personally don't have, but is very unique, even among African Americans, if I can say that as well.
Well, I want to, I need to say thank you to my friends and coworkers who are here and joined us on board just for the sake of social justice and just out of their love. I guess I could claim that for myself. They are not here because they're Muslim. They are here because they are great people who stand for social justice. And I want the panel to know I greatly appreciate my friends here, my interfaith friends, my colleagues, my girlfriends, whomever. In regards to that, well, my God, Brother Human, I got a lot to say, so I'm going to try to tune into that. This is a very difficult subject to approach because of my age, because I was the group of African American children who were bussed in. My brothers, God bless them, both struggled very much through the civil rights movement. Okay, so I reaped the benefits, if you could say that, but I was a bussed in Black kid. I'm from an area south of Chicago called Markham that was actually built a year, my parents moved in a year to the day when I was born, literally. That area was built for Blacks. We found out 30 years ago that area is built on a toxic dump site. So we've had, just on our block alone, we've had 6 people come down with cancer. My mother was one, and other people that lived on the block too. So that's a whole nother subject. I've had 3 lives as a Black girl, okay, then as a young Muslim lady, then I've had my life as a Muslim immigrant. Now, and my girlfriends who are on here, they know the stories very well. I even had one go with me to IKEA just to put a scarf on her head to see what it was like to be Muslim. She said, I want to try this out and see what it feels like. Okay, she's not Muslim. So those 3 lives, it's very difficult. And then, you know, my husband is not African American. My husband, yes, is from Turkey. So we have the whole biracial element in regards to the children in and outside of the Muslim community. Colorism, I'm going to summarize it real quick. And Imam said the same thing when we spoke the other day. Colorism plays a very huge role I see it also in the workplace as a registered nurse. How many times do people assume that I'm housekeeping or I'm food service? Okay, even I have a big badge that underneath my name that says RN in bold black letters, but I must be housekeeping or food service. Okay, I have had people request a different nurse because they didn't want to see me come in with a scarf on my head. Now, on the other hand, when we flip over and we think of colorism, and anyone out there who's African American knows very well what I mean, I can get through a lot of doors because my blackness is not offensive. I'm not dark enough to be offensive. All my life, I've grown up with people telling me, oh, I forgot you're black. I totally forget all the time. You're just like us. I have heard that and seen that outside of the Muslim community. I have seen and heard that inside the Muslim community. I've stories that go on and on and on, all the way around. Out on the street, it's always assumed that I'm an immigrant and I don't speak English. Until I say a few choice words and regain myself, and then they realize my English is very good. Okay. I've even had a nurse and I'll call them out on it. When I was training at Christ Hospital, I had a preceptor, which would be my educator to orientate me, train me to the floor. Even my own mother told me, Donna, she doesn't know you're American. She doesn't think you're black. She would go through my charting and correct my English consistently. I've got a ton of stories. And I must add also, because my experience is so unique, I've had the pleasure or downfall of experiencing international global racism. I lived 7 years in Switzerland. Until my German got good enough, I'd been spit on. I was physically beat. If I had been pregnant, I probably would have lost the baby because I got meat in my stomach. We could not find housing for at least 4 years because no one wanted to rent to us because we were Muslim. People who did hear me speaking English to my children in Switzerland couldn't understand how I spoke English. And when I told them I was African American, they couldn't fathom that either. It got so bad, finally I told my husband, I can't live here. I said, Dr. King marched too long, and many others, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, so many others, so many whites, Jews, Christians had died for our cause in the 1960s through the civil rights movement. And I said, I just can't live here. My people fought too long for me to live here and live like that. I had women in grocery stores run their shopping carts into my heels. I had a neighbor actually complain about one of our daughters who would hear the dog in the apartment barking, and my little girl would bark back, and the neighbor actually said to us, well, our dog only likes Swiss children. I mean, I could write a book on the stories alone. It goes on and on and on. In our community, we have to deal with this. We really have to deal with this too. We have to get these liquor stores. We have to get these liquor stores out of our community because it's giving a very bad impression and to our non-Muslim brothers and sisters of what they think of Muslims. That's another point. Everybody has a very bad liquor store owner, and they don't remember the person's ethnicity. They only remember that these people are Muslim. That's a lot. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, no, so subhanAllah. I mean, I think this section really was an opportunity for us to look at some of the personal narratives of you all as panelists, coming from the diversity of experiences that you've had, but converging on the fact that this very much affects your day-to-day kind of experience in your lifetime. It's a story and layer of your lives that can't be forgotten or can't be ignored. And yeah.
Let me just say this too. Thank you so much, Dr. Jalil. I appreciate your patience with me. I appreciate that. Let me just say this again. My colleagues and friends that are on board, I actually had one go to bat with me because I was being discriminated against as a Muslim woman who wears a scarf, who they thought was an immigrant, where she actually went forward to management through HR. She had my back on that. I even had a doctor, a Hindu doctor, tell me as I was going to California to visit family, he says, you know, when you get where you're going, you can take all that off because nobody really knows who you are. He was consistently picking at me. Last experience I have to share with you guys, I worked 15 years at Little Company of Mary. Everybody here knows where that hospital is. I worked on several floors. I'm a very well-trained, by the grace of God, a very well-trained and diverse a nurse. And it was 15 years before they actually knew I was African-American. How did that happen? September 11th happened. And I just told all my colleagues after 15 years, I said, you know, there's not only Arabs are a minority in Islam. A lot of people are Muslim and we're not Arab. Well, where are you from? I'm from Markham. Anybody who knows Markham knows it's a town, again, that was built for blacks. And they said, really? I said, yeah. And the minute that came out, I get a totally different set of treatment. You go from being treated as an immigrant to getting treated much worse. And I've said before, when people cannot see your hair, they cannot categorize you based on how kinky or how straight your hair is. You will, if your hair is kinky enough, you'll get the Negro treatment. If it's not kinky enough, they want to know who in your family is white. So this is pretty much the experience of being a woman of color who happens to be Muslim and who crosses over the color line. My colleagues who were African-American but who were darker got treated much worse than I did. The minute they even looked angry, everyone was afraid of them. And we're all nurses. So we can't even add the gender issue in it of men. And I imagine being a darker African-American man, and my two brothers here can speak on that. I imagine being a darker African-American man, that's even worse of an issue because your color is definitely a threat. And that's something I want people to know. Can you testify to that, please?
And yeah, let me mention that not only being darker African-American perceived as a threat, but as someone who played college football, darker, very muscular, extra large African-Americans walking in groups are really threats. See, and I got to experience all of that by Allah's grace to maintain my connection to what goes on with the masses. And I want to just connect the quick dots. I know we're going to start heading towards some take-home points, but one, the racial profiling didn't start with 9/11. The police and mass incarceration and mistreatment while you're incarcerated didn't start with Guantanamo Bay. And what you're hearing is what is happening when there's an intersection of ethnicity, African and African descent, also religion coming together. But this is really a wake-up call for us to look at what has been happening systematically for years and step up to the plate. And I'm just like you, Sister Donna, I'm very proud of my coworkers who have been, I won't even joke, they've been more militant than me, or as militant as me, and who are the non-African Americans, European Americans, Latinos, Asians, who are all sacrificing and speaking up, saying we've got to reverse this systemic structural racism and violence reflected in police brutality and murder, but not limited to that, and some of the things that Sheikh Abdul Malik has mentioned with housing, employment, healthcare, and everything else. I just want to also emphasize, though, we're still in the midst of the siege. So I personally was grilled all day yesterday by my 11-year-old daughter saying, what is going on in this world and what are we supposed to do about it? And she's still going to have to deal with this, right? These are not old stories that we've gone. She's concerned. She grilled me all day yesterday when we were hanging out. What is going on? Why are these things happening? What are we supposed to be doing? What are they going to do to us if we start speaking up? What did the Prophet ﷺ do? Also with my 19-year-old daughter, who is a college student, but is not immune to this and is immersed in a lot of these online and offline protests, and my 23-year-old son, who I didn't just have the talk. Okay, I continue to have talks about how to survive contact with potentially explosive racial dynamics, not only with police, but with larger society. And yes, we need to keep in mind, there's a whole window of consciousness which is opening across a wide spectrum of society. I'll say from my 55 years that I have not seen since, but I'll say even beyond what happened with Rodney King. There's a different energy, there's a different scope. You see the international demonstrations. I think we really have to start talking about what are we going to do moving forward to capitalize on this awakening and this potential window of opportunity so it just doesn't fade away, just like what happened after the Ferguson, Missouri situation. I'm in Chicago. We have a long history of police torture. Okay, it's well documented. John Burge, infamous, used to torture people of African descent here when they used to arrest them. They just exposed Holman Square, which is a few blocks from my office in Chicago, where they were taking people when they arrested them and torturing confessions out of them. We're in the city of Laquan McDonald. Okay, so we have a lot of work to do, but I do think we have an opportunity by Allah's grace to start making a difference from a wider swath of society than has happened in recent memory.
Yeah, I wanted to transition, Jazakallah khair, to all of you for these, kind of eye-opening experiences that you can speak to. And I hear all of you guys saying that some of the things that you've appreciated a lot is individuals who have really stepped up to the plate to really have your back at times when you were being isolated, at times when you were being harassed or attacked. And what I'm hearing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and as we're transitioning into the takeaways of what those, like we have, 75 people, 80 with the panelists. This is a large group of people here, and one person can have a circular impact, right? Have a domino effect. And so the question is, what do we do? Because we don't want this event to be just a, storytelling event, right? That's not, this isn't kind of, voyeurism. Like we just kind of opened up a camera and let all these Black people speak. You see what I'm saying? And hear their stories, and we had a good time. It's like a Netflix movie, but in our community, and we just walk away and go to bed and we forget about it. The question is, what do we do, and what roles do we play, and what responsibilities do we have? We know as Muslims, we have responsibilities, right? And when you learn of something, you can't forget it anymore. You see what I'm saying? And so the question is, what responsibilities do we have? And I'm hearing a little bit of forming alliances, sort of connecting and making sure that this momentum turns into this movement that just doesn't die, but has a trickle-down effect where it starts to change things and the way things are done. Can we speak to what could we be doing? And obviously we're not gonna, we have what, 10 minutes, 15 minutes at most to do that. So obviously we're not even gonna scratch the surface. And
if I could just jump in.
Yeah, please.
I think as Muslims, it would be remiss, especially with Khalil Center and everything that our three panelists, if we would not mention the Prophet ﷺ and the early Muslims who are supposed to be our qudwa, are supposed to be our example that we're supposed to be taking from. And Islam is we know, gives the ultimate examples for everything. But Islam is a tool that we have to utilize in order to see impact on us. Because even amongst the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, there were prejudices that were said. And how the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ answered them was by saying, when one companion told another, Ya ibn Sauda, O son of a Black woman, the Prophet ﷺ said, Fika jahiliya, you still have some pre-Islamic ignorance in you. You still have some ignorance in you. And so the first thing that we have to do is really have some introspective thought about ourselves and understanding what is going on. When Malcolm was asked by the young white woman, what can I do? He said, go back to your community and work on inside your community. And so for us, speaking to a diverse community, we need to go back to ourselves. What do I think when I'm around my Black brothers and sisters? What do I think and feel when someone with a hoodie on is behind me and I'm walking down a dark alley? What do I feel like when I see someone who, whatever the case may be? We need to start eradicating and learning about ourselves, uplifting the organizations that are doing anti-racism work, but learning about the problems we got. Because if we don't fix our house, then what we doing? And my last point on that is something that was very, very important during the civil rights movement was they had brotherhood and sisterhood and companionship amongst the people they were with and together on the front lines. If we don't have good connections, if we don't know each other and we can't trust in each other, remind you that the Southern Christian leadership movement that Martin was a part of and led was both Black and white. Well, it's because they knew each other and they trusted each other, they were able to sit on the bus. They were able to, or boycott, and they were able to sit at the counter because they knew each other and trusted each other. So my thing is, when we need to reconnect with our tradition, not just in a superficial reading and like, yes, Islam is anti-racism, go ahead, Bilal, Musa was Black too. No, we need to understand the ills and the ignorance that we have inside of us and work to eradicate that lillah for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that we can be better people, better Muslims, inshallah, people whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves.
And I would thank you so much for that, Imam. I would add that it is our responsibility through our faith tradition, and I appeal to my Christian and Jewish friends who are here. It's all, and I've actually put it in a small chat note. We know what to do. We know what to do by our religious faith traditions. You know, we have to do this. It's the right thing to do. It's the God-like thing to do. It's to stand against oppression and social injustices. We all know what to do. But we need everybody on board, which is exactly what, you know, you're saying that too. We need everybody on board. What's wrong for another is for one is wrong for another. What's that little parable? Everybody knows that story where, you know, they come knocking on the door and they took away one neighbor and the person looked, and then they came and they took away the other neighbor. You guys know what I'm talking about? It's a long story. I don't know if it's related to the Holocaust or whatever, but they came and they knocked and they took until finally they came and knocked on one person's door and there was no one there to stand for them. This is what we're talking about. And I keep saying over and over and over again, it's a quote from Mother Teresa: one of the worst diseases in the world is to be nobody to everybody or anybody. And you know, we have to move through this. We need help. We have to stand in our faith traditions. We know what that is as Muslims. Our brothers and sisters who are not Muslim, they know what that is in their faith tradition too. But we really are all in this together. And that leads me to a job I actually had to quit at Christ Hospital because I did say that we're all in this together. We really are. You know, what happens to me will happen to someone else.
Yeah. Go ahead, sister.
No, I was just going to say that's a good takeaway for I want our listeners who speak Arabic, I want them to please reconsider the word abida. I want them to consider that. When you translate it, it's absolutely horrible. It hits every single African American Muslim or African American non-Muslim who understands the root of it. It's so misused. It's so misused. The way it hits my ears is, as an African American woman, it's extremely painful. Just as the word black in German. It's hurtful. I'm not even gonna say it. Google it. That's not what they mean, but the way it hurts our ears, it's gotta change. We live in a country where that word carries a lot of weight, a lot of painful weight. So I'm gonna appeal to my Arabic speaking friends, stop using that word. You wanna walk away with something? Stop using that word. Try to understand what this pain might be like. Because we've carried it, you know, as Dr. Jalil said, we've carried it for 400 years. You don't see it in our faces. I'm not gonna just talk to you about it if I work with you. Why would I? You know, really, why would I? But I know stories from my grandmother and my great-grandmother and the great-grandfather and the great-great-grandfather. And as I said yesterday at ICC, has anybody ever thought for 1 second, look at any ethnic group of people. Polish people look alike. You can tell when someone's Polish. I don't mean look alike in a bad term. I'm saying there's certain ways that people look similar from different parts of the world, right? You know, there's a Moroccan look, there's an Egyptian look, there's a West African look, there's an Ethiopian look, there's a German look, there's a British look. I mean, it is. These are just genetic features, not in a bad way, I mean it. But has anyone ever thought why African Americans don't look alike? Even American Indians, if you know enough, you can tell who is Navajo, who is Sioux, right? Anybody ever thought why we don't look alike? We don't look alike because of what happened to us. So this carries over in our genes every single day. We don't look alike because of rape. We do our genetic screening, our numbers are very high of white blood. That's a reminder that something happened. These were not consensual relationships. So long story short, the more people read, the more people take the time to understand, or just ask one of us. Some of us are more willing to talk about it than others. The more you understand, the more you'll understand. I think that's a good thing to take away with. I did take photos of a suggested reading list that I think could interest someone out there. Some of them are books based on sociological perspective. Some are fiction.
Right.
Brother Human has
send it out. We'll send it out, inshallah, to all of those who had RSVP'd. And if you didn't, then go ahead and email. I'm going to type it in, community@khalilcenter.com. If you didn't end up RSVPing and you want that resource list. Dr. Jalil?
Just quickly, I'd like to add that the Prophet ﷺ said, if anybody sees something evil, you should correct it with your hand. If you can't, with your tongue. If you can't, with your heart, until you could get to the other two. So I would hope that we would rise to this occasion and speak out against some of these systemic, structural, anti-Black racist problems which have happened, because they do affect not just African Americans, but humanity. Because just as easy as an oppressive dynamic can be applied to one group, it can very easily be shifted toward another. And I've even seen it done against poor white. Okay, so we want to make sure we address this. So my three things I suggest is, one, as we've said, please let's educate, or really re-educate ourselves about the history of African people in this country, African Americans, and African Muslims in this country and around the world, so we could think differently about the dignity that are deserved and what was taken away through historical trauma. Secondly, we need to incorporate this into our daily conversations to change the atmosphere. This is not something that's only for a webinar, only specialized books. We need a challenge on the job, in the home, amongst family gatherings, in public. Be very active and very assertive to speak against and act against all of these types of injustices which happen, even at the personal self-sacrifice. Third is for us to emulate the example of the Prophet ﷺ as Muslims, which is our uswa hasana, our model, is that even when there's sacrifice, there's struggle, it may not be popular. Now everybody's taking, saying Black Lives Matter. Well, there was a time that was like a curse word. Now all of a sudden things are changing. Really, for us, we should do what's right because it's right, not because it's popular, or not because it's accepted, or not because it's become a buzzword. And I do hope that this notion, which is different, we're talking about structural racism, systemic violence, white supremacy and its derivatives, which include Black self-hatred, are things that we could start addressing forcefully until we can eradicate them, inshallah. And eradicate doesn't mean we pretend we'll be perfect. Eradicate means we commit to doing what's right, including when we make mistakes, correcting ourselves instead of justifying it, institutionally or otherwise.
You mentioned something, Dr. Jalil, about self-hate. And I think I can remember in psychology when they had the African-American children being given a choice between the white and the Black doll, and they ended up choosing the white ones, which kind of speaks to this sort of subconscious internalization. I always wondered, and my guess would be that if you did the same thing with Arab or South Asian or whatever else, that you'd get the same outcome. And the reason why I say that, I want to speak to this because there's something very unique about a sort of white and European problems that have been that have also kind of plagued the Muslim world, that I think affects us as immigrant Muslims or the children of immigrants. And that is that this is a global phenomenon, right? What ended up happening was that, you know, the European and white customs were always was seen as superior, and it was brought on the back of colonialism to the Muslim world. So the Muslims in general as a whole have suffered trauma, right, as a result of this. And so the closer you get to things that are further, the further, you know, the closer you get to things that remind you of that which is not European, right, the more discomfort that you end up having, even if it's subconscious. You see what I'm saying? We've forgotten our own culture, our own customs, our own, and that's not to conflate it with it's not nowhere near the African-American experience, but it does give a unique characterization, and I can speak as the children of immigrants, of how the psyche ends up working in really internalizing, right, that European by default is best. You see what I'm saying? And when I was in, you know, when I give a talk in Turkey, for example, jokingly, some of my colleagues told me, you know what, because my Turkish isn't that great. And he said, I said, you know, I'm going to struggle to speak in Turkish. It's okay, speak in English. It'll be more scientific. It'll be more intellectual, right? And I was like, are you kidding me? Right? So people will see it that way. Do you see what I'm saying? And so now when you have things that are further and further away from that which is white and European, the greater the discomfort. And so I think that self-hate among the Muslim community exists, and then it gets scapegoated on certain people in our community as well. The darker your skin, for example, the less European you look, the less European you exemplify, right? And so I think there are those aspects, and I'm just kind of speaking to those from like me, people like me who grew up with, in those environments that struggled, right? And I think those are things that we have to recognize that may be part of these hidden biases that we may not always be kind of fully attentive to. But I want to give a minute each to some closing remarks, if we can, inshallah. And I want to respect the time of everybody who's on here, the panelists as well as the audience, to keep to our time, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
Hold me to my minute, okay? When you talk about, again, this global racism that has come up, I just got to make this last point because this is going to be very shocking. At least it was to me, in any case. When I'm in West Africa, I'm considered white. I get charged the white woman price. I get treated better because I'm considered white. I'm considered white because of the nature of colonialism. And as people intermarried and the numbers of the colonialists were lower, they took the biracial kids and pulled them to their side and considered them white. Okay, so I'm considered white. Can you imagine, Brother Human as a therapist and also Dr. Jalil, my first trip to Rwanda, and I walk in there as a proud African-American woman feeling myself very Black, irregardless to what someone thinks or whatever, and I find out I'm getting charged the white woman price. I literally had a meltdown, you know, if we're going to get personal. So yes, racism is global. Everything you're saying is absolutely true. And I appeal to everyone, think about this, develop some type of understanding, a minute sense of empathy to understand why we're so angry and how we're trying to work through the trauma of all of this from generations. Thank you so much.
Sheikh Abdul Malik?
I thought Dr. Jalil was going to go. My closing remark is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells in the Quran, "I'dilu fa inna aqrabu lit-taqwa." Be just because that is better, that is closer to piety or God consciousness. If I was to part with anything, that we should all engage in the study of our tradition, but not just the superficial study, but the work, the internal work on our own nufus, all of us, Black, white, regardless, immigrant, non-immigrant, so that we can be people whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with, and so that we can do the work that is required within our families, our small social circles, and then inshallah we can uplift society that way.
Jazakallah khair for having me. The only thing I would say is thank you all for taking time out for this serious and hopefully provocative discussion we had, establish at least one thing new to inform your mind, and one thing new or one thing we could do better to stand forth for justice. So this doesn't become just a moment in time, it becomes a movement, not a moment.
Yes, thank you all too. Special thanks and jazakumullahu khairan to the panel for taking the time out. We all came together on in a very short period of time, and I know that you all kind of extended yourselves and making yourselves available. I really appreciate that. And also to all of our listeners and all that joined on a Sunday afternoon. I know Sundays on a weekend, people got a lot of things to do, and it definitely shows that people took this topic seriously enough to devote the time to sit in, to learn, to reflect, and to be a part of this program. And I know that this is just the beginning, inshallah. And I hope that this will, be beneficial for us. Jazakumullah khaira, barakallahu feekum. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.